here to save lives. But the hospital wants yours. The tires of Dr. Greta Lang's car crunched over the gravel road, the sound swallowed by the heavy silence pressing from the overcast sky. The hospital loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette twisting subtly when viewed from the corner of her eye. Vines and dark moss clung to the grey stone, an eerie relic of a forgotten era. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale as bone. As she stepped out, the air hit her, a damp, metallic chill clinging to her skin. A faint scent of antiseptic drifted from the entrance, undercut by something else. Rotting. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed weakly, casting a sickly glow over peeling wallpaper. The receptionist barely looked up. His eyes flicked past her, as if expecting someone else. "Dr. Calloway is waiting in the central ward," he said. "Turn right, then left, and—" "I'd avoid the mirrored corridor." Greta frowned. "Why?" He didn't answer. The hallways stretched unnervingly long, walls lined with tarnished mirrors. Greta hesitated, catching a glimpse of her reflection. Something about it felt delayed. When she turned her head fully, the mirrors reflected only what they should. A trick of the light, surely. She quickened her pace. The central ward was vast, thick with the hum of machines and muttered whispers. Greta's eyes landed on a young woman, Karina. Barely 20, her pale skin marred by intricate spiraling scars beneath bandages. "She's been like this since she arrived," said Nurse Lena Torres. "She mutters about a house, about fire. The spirals appear when she speaks of it." Greta traced the edge of one spiral with gloved fingers. The raised flesh was too perfect, too deliberate, like something etched from within. Karina stirred, lips trembling. "The walls, the fire, left me there." A chill crawled up Greta's spine. She pulled back quickly, masking her unease. "She needs to be transferred to the experimental wing. We need to suppress the memory trigger." Lena's gaze darkened. "Are you sure that's wise?" "I'm here to find answers." And she would, no matter the cost. The experimental wing was colder than expected, its sterile walls bearing faint spirals she hadn't noticed before. She brushed her fingers over one absent-mindedly and shuddered. Irrational. Her small office was cluttered with patient files, but her mind returned to Karina's words. The house, the fire. Greta's own memories wavered in response, childhood glimpses of smoke, heat, a scream echoing too clearly. A knock jolted her. Lena stood in the doorway, tense. "Karina's awake. She's asking for you." Greta followed her into the ward. Karina sat upright, her gaze sharp, too knowing. "You're the doctor," she whispered. "Are you here to take it away?" Greta hesitated. "Take what away?" Karina's fingers clawed at the sheets. "The house, the walls. It won't let me go." Greta leaned closer. "Describe the house. What do you see?" Karina gasped. Her body stiffened, eyes rolling back. The spirals on her arms darkened, glowing faintly. Then she whispered, "It's inside you too." The monitors shrieked. Karina convulsed. Lena shouted for help, but Greta barely heard her over the sudden rush of whispers, not from Karina, but from the walls. Later, in her office, Greta traced the patterns in Karina's scans. The spirals weren't random, they were structured, language. A knock startled her. She turned, but the doorway was empty. Then the lights flickered, and in the mirror across the room, her reflection didn't move. Her breath stalled. Slowly, she stepped closer. The mirrored version of herself remained frozen, its face expressionless, wrong. The whispers in the walls grew louder. Then her reflection smiled, not a normal smile, too wide, too knowing. The spirals on its skin pulsed, shifting and growing like living scars. Greta stumbled back, crashing into her desk. When she looked again, her reflection was normal, haggard, exhausted, herself. But the whispers didn't stop. She yanked up her sleeve. There, on her forearm, the first traces of a spiral had begun to emerge. The realization slammed into her. The hospital wasn't studying the spirals, the hospital was making them. The next morning, Greta confronted Dr. Calloway. "You knew," he sighed. "The body remembers, Dr. Lang. Trauma leaves imprints, on flesh, on walls, on places like this." Greta shook her head. "That doesn't explain why I have them." Calloway's gaze darkened. "Because the hospital chose you." The walls pulsed faintly, the spirals beneath her skin burned, and Greta realized with horrifying certainty that she was never meant to leave. "Someone's in your photos, but you were alone." Alex Marshall never intended to return to his grandfather's house. The attic had been off limits when he was a child, his mother's sharp warnings always laced with something that felt less like fear and more like reverence. But now, with his grandfather gone, the house was his. And the attic door, long forgotten beneath layers of dust, stood slightly ajar. The air was thick with neglect, carrying the scent of mothballs and something metallic. The wooden floor groaned under his steps as he ventured deeper into the attic's gloom. Boxes slumped under their own weight, forgotten relics of a life preserved in dust. But it was the wooden chest beneath the farthest window that caught his eye. He crouched, brushing off cobwebs, and pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay an antique camera, its body engraved with intricate swirling patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The lens, unnaturally pristine despite the years, reflected the dim light like a black hole. No brand, no markings, just a single roll of undeveloped film tucked beside it. The weight of the camera was wrong, too heavy, too cold. He should have left it there. Back in his apartment, the bathroom had been hastily transformed into a dark room. The air reeked of developer fluid and nostalgia. Alex worked methodically, unspooling the ancient film, his fingers trembling as the images slowly emerged in the dim red glow. The first frame showed an empty hallway, the wallpaper peeling in forgotten curls. The second, a dusty parlor with an old piano. But the third, his breath hitched. The attic, his grandfather's attic. The angle was impossibly familiar, as though someone had stood exactly where he had hours before. The chest was there, the same lights slanting through the grime-streaked window. But something was different. The lid was open, and a figure stood beside it. Alex stumbled back, knocking over a tray of chemicals. The acrid scent stung his nose, but he barely noticed. His hands shook as he fumbled for the next photograph. The figure was closer now, blurred at the edges as though the film had captured something it wasn't meant to. A tall shape, featureless but looming, its presence thick with intent. The final frame sent ice through his veins. His own bedroom, his own bed, the camera's perspective impossibly perched at the foot of it, and the figure standing right beside him. A whisper slid through the room, though the windows were shut. The shadows around him stretched, deepened, pulsed. Somewhere in the darkness, the camera shutter clicked, and this time Alex knew he wasn't the one holding it. The electricity flickered, a cold weight settled in his stomach. Alex's breath came fast and shallow as he grabbed the film, shoving it back into its envelope. His reflection in the mirror across the room wavered, a slight delay before mirroring his movements. The air pressed heavier against him. It felt wrong, like the walls themselves were listening. A floorboard creaked, not under his feet. Slowly, Alex turned toward the bedroom doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, but something shifted within it. a subtle movement just out of sight. He wasn't alone. The camera still sat on the counter, its lens gleaming in the dim light. The urge to grab it, to capture whatever was lurking in the shadows, clawed at him. His fingers twitched toward it, but something deeper, something primal, screamed at him not to. The whisper came again, closer this time, just behind his ear. Click! The power surged back to life, the overhead bulb flaring too bright before settling into an uneasy glow. Alex stood frozen, his body trembling. He turned back to the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, wide-eyed, breathless. But his reflection's hands were empty. The camera was gone. Every time you sleep, reality shifts. The coffee mug in Eliza's hand felt wrong. Not just different, wrong. The deep crimson glaze, the faint chip on the rim. It had been hers for years, but now the color seemed off, too saturated, too perfect. She blinked. The mug was green. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked again, harder. Red. The air in the apartment thickened, pressing against her chest. The heater's low hum stuttered, the light outside shifted, and for a fraction of a second the world itself seemed to flicker. Her hands trembled as she set the mug down, trying to convince herself it was just exhaustion, just a trick of the light. But when she turned toward her bookshelf, the photograph of her and Harper from college had changed. Harper had always been laughing in that picture, her face half turned toward Eliza, the late afternoon sun making her short black hair glow. But now Harper stood alone. Her expression was sharper, thinner, her dark eyes vacant. And where the stack of books had been beside Eliza, there was now only an empty space. A smear of red blurred the corner of the frame. Eliza's stomach churned. She reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the glass as if touching it could restore what was lost. The surface was warm, too warm. Her reflection in the black monitor caught her attention. She turned slowly. Her own face stared back, hollow-eyed and pale, but there was something off. The angles of her face were subtly wrong, her eyes a fraction too wide, her lips parted as if mid-whisper, and then her reflection blinked. She hadn't. A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. She flinched, spinning toward the sound. Her pulse pounded. No one ever came to her apartment, not unannounced. "Eliza?" Her breath caught. The voice was familiar, cold. She stepped toward the door, her skin prickling. The air smelled different now, thick with something floral, something sickly sweet. Lavender. "Eliza!" The knock came again, more insistent. Her fingers hovered over the handle. The peephole was black, an abyss of nothingness. She didn't dare look through it. She swallowed hard. "Who is it?" Silence. Her phone buzzed violently on the desk. The screen glowed. "Mom." Her mother's voice was sharp. "Eliza, you need to come home." Her stomach twisted. "Why?" A pause. The static on the line thickened. Then, "Your father's things. We need to sort through them." The air in her apartment tightened. She turned back toward the black monitor. Her reflection was still watching, and this time it was smiling. The house loomed against the storm-grey sky, its wooden frame warped by time and salt air. The moment Eliza stepped out of the car, the scent of lavender hit her like a wave. Stronger than before, lingering. Her mother met her at the door, thinner than she remembered, her sharp eyes scanning Eliza as if looking for something. "You're late." No greeting, no warmth. Eliza stepped inside, the familiar scent of damp wood wrapping around her. The house was too still, like it was listening. The walls, once pale blue, seemed darker, the corners of the room stretching unnaturally. She hesitated before climbing the stairs to her childhood room. The wooden steps groaned under her weight. Each creak felt deliberate, purposeful, Her door was closed. It hadn't been before. She pushed it open. Inside, the room was just as she left it. But the mirror on the far wall was shattered, its jagged edges catching the dim light. Her reflection stared back in fragmented pieces. Then, in the largest shard, she saw something else. A figure, standing behind her. "Eliza!" She spun, but the room was empty. The whisper curled through the air, slipping between the cracks of the walls, seeping into her bones. A memory surfaced, fingers slipping from her grasp, a scream lost to the wind, the crash of waves against jagged rock. A presence, always just beyond the edge of her vision. The mirror pulsed, the reflection of the room warped, stretching, shifting. And then her reflection stepped forward. Not the real her, not quite. "Eliza," it whispered again, voice curling into a sickening smile. "You're remembering." The world flickered, and everything changed.